Charlie, I'm going to hand straight over to you. I was very excited to see the results of the global survey on AI use in dozens of newsrooms all over the world. And as Australian newsrooms begin to think, how do we strategize something that's moving so quickly for next year, it seemed like a really good time to revisit some of your key findings and then some of the takeaways from that. So I'll hand straight over to you for that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Corinne. Thank you very much. Yeah, as you say, I'll be talking about this global survey that we did as a way, really, to explain what I think newsrooms are doing with AI this year. Obviously, it's been a very special year. So I'll talk through that, but then I'll get to some thoughts about how any newsroom should be approaching it right now. So I think there's some really useful stuff in here for everybody. So I'm going to do that thing of sharing my screen.
Fantastic.
I hope you can all see that now.
Yes, wonderful. Absolutely can. And as you're doing that, Charlie, what we would love is the Q&A box is at the bottom if you've got questions for any of our speakers today. And we're also going to enable the chat. So if you'd like to share a bit about what you're doing with AI, introduce yourself and where you're joining from, we'd be very happy to hear from you. Over to you, Charlie.
Thanks, Corinne. So just to explain who I am, where the hell I'm coming from, apart from East London on a Sunday night, a very cold, rainy Sunday night in London. I'm a former journalist, mainly in television, about 25 years at places like the BBC and so on. And then I joined the LSE in 2005. And basically, I've been through a lot of media changes, mainly technological. The internet came along when I was a journalist, and then after I joined the LSE to set up Polish, you get social media coming along. And then 5 years ago, I kind of thought, well, AI, artificial intelligence, this bundle of technologies, machine learning, natural language processing, and so on. I felt this was the next kind of wave of technological change. So we set up this program, Journalism AI, at the LSE. And as Corinne mentioned, we've got a festival next week, which sort of celebrates the work we do. And you can just go to our website, JournalismAI, LSE, Polis, and there is a whole mound of resources for you. AI starter pack, we do training for journalists. Some of it is very simple, some of it is a bit more advanced. We run an academy for small newsrooms around the world. I'm really pleased next year we're going to be doing a Spanish one in Latin America, for example. We also run a course called the Digital Discovery course. And again, we're going to be doing that in different languages, Spanish, Arabic, probably even Australian at some point. And you're welcome to do that. And we do these collaborative fellowships where teams of journalists from different organizations work on particular programs that are projects that are interested in trying to deal with certain kind of issues, which some of them are very practical, some are more ethical or editorial. This year, the team have been working on generative AI projects. So I just try and talk you through some of the lessons we've learned over the last few years. This is even before we get to generative AI, all that kind of exciting chat GPT and so on. It was very clear that AI, artificial intelligence, can help you across all aspects of news work. It can help with news gathering. It can help with news production, creating that content. And perhaps most important in some ways, it can help with news distribution. It can help you to disseminate your work, but also to raise revenue. And it can do that automatically, either autonomously or helping support journalists, marketing people in your news organization. So some of this is quite old school now, like, for example, the Reuters News Tracer, which has been, I think, around 7 or 8 years now. And it helps Reuters, a massive news agency, filter through the whole of social media, looking for stories, looking for emerging events that then their journalists can turn into stories. This was an example from Swedish radio, who are absolutely brilliant at journalism and AI. And they created this tool. It's an internal tool. It's not for the audience, it's for the journalists, and it recommends them content. So when they're doing a particular story, it will immediately refer to mainly archive that might be useful for that journalist to tell that particular story. Again, it does it automatically, saving time and effort for the journalist. And then the money, propensity models. This was an example from Schibsted, also a Scandinavian publisher. And the idea of this was that you could use artificial intelligence to look at what people were doing when they clicked on your website. How many times do they have to click on your website before you start trying to sell them your subscription or membership, for example? And if you do try and sell them the subscription or membership, what do you have to do? Is it 20% discount, 50% discount? And AI can at least help you in that process. And obviously that's incredibly important in terms of independent private media. And then along comes, literally, I think a year ago, almost to the day, along comes the release with OpenAI of ChatGPT. And as we now know, this was an incredibly rushed release. It was kind of in beta. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't really ready. They were rushing ahead, partly because of commercial rivalry. Boy, anybody who clicked on ChatGPT and started to put in prompts realized this was a rather interesting, almost miraculous kind of tool. And I think that's the most important thing about Gen AI, actually, especially with ChatGPT, is that it's so easy to access. Those previous tools that I talked to you about, they were ones that you really had to be a bit techie. Perhaps you even needed to code, or you need to know how algorithms work to understand them. But with generative AI, anybody, even an idiot like me, can use these tools. Your boss can use them, the intern can use them, the marketing people can use them, everyone can use them. And we have all been exploring over the last year what they can do. And we know that there are these incredible products like ChatGPT, like Midjourney, like Synthesia, you know, the ability to create video using generative AI. And I'm not going to go on about the technology itself, you know, the transformers and the servers and all that stuff. But I think it's really important to remember that these tools are fantastic and they have incredible potential, but we're also very acutely aware of the problems with them as well. And we'll deal with that a little bit more, but mainly it's because it's been released so quickly by a number of different companies around the world, spawning thousands of tools and products based on some of these large language models. So what did we do? A few months ago, we thought, wow, we've got to know more about what's going on. So we decided to repeat our global survey that we did in 2019. And this time we did it, it was much bigger. It reached much more globally, more than 100 news organizations around the world. And we interviewed them in depth about what they were doing with AI, if you like, traditional AI, but also generative AI, of course, but also interestingly about what they thought about it, what they thought the risks and opportunities were, as well as the potential use cases. And the most obvious thing that we got back was that everyone is experimenting with generative AI, with the new versions of generative AI, like ChatGPT and DALL-E. I think it's interesting that 14% weren't. I'd love to know who they were. I'd also like to know who the 1% is who's unclear, because you kind of think you should know if you're experimenting or not. But anyway, the clear thing there was that people are experimenting with it, and they're doing it much more than they used to do in the past. But again, that key idea that's right across the news process. So if you think, oh, it's all right, I'm in news gathering, I don't need to pay attention to this, or I'm in news distribution, I don't. Yes, you do, because this is going to impact on every single aspect of the news production process. And you can, if you go to the report, it's all online. very accessible. You'll see loads of examples and quotes from people talking about different ways they are. Also, how they're not. People are cautious about the idea of using it to publish directly, for example. You certainly can't rely on this thing for 100%, but there are loads of different ways that it can help supplement your work. Some of them quite technical, some of them more simple and practical. And yes, people expect to be using this more in the future. That's not so surprising. Perhaps more interesting is when you look at what kind of areas. And again, it's everything really, but some really interesting ones. Super important, of course, is fact checking and disinformation analysis. Many places in the world are getting swamped by disinformation. Got a big year coming up with some big elections. So it's interesting that people are using it to try and counter some of that. Content personalization and automation. Again, we're very conscious that people feel swamped by the amount of news out there. There's too much of it. It's too confusing. So can we use this AI to help with that? Well, one of the ways you can do that is through, for example, text summarization or generation. So it can be something very simple, like if you've got text, you can very easily convert it to audio using AI. And that last one I thought was really interesting, the idea of using chatbots. They're much more sophisticated now. You remember those clunky chatbots that you used to get on like airline websites and stuff? Dreadful. But the new chatbots, especially fueled by generative AI, are much more sophisticated. So you can use them to do things like, conduct interviews. And I thought it was an interesting idea that using it to get a sense of what your audience is thinking about particular issues. So definitely going to be more AI. Clearly, there are huge challenges to trying to adopt it. And the biggest ones are around, the technical challenge, trying to understand it, trying to implement it, and having the time and the money and the resources to do so. How do you hire the people who know about this stuff? But then there's other big challenges as well around ethics. People worried about stuff. We'll come to that in a second. Cultural challenges, people worried about losing their jobs and so on. And there's always managerial challenges, aren't there? But yeah, definitely a big sense that these are huge opportunities presented by generative AI, along with those new challenges and a lot of uncertainty. And that is not surprising. So if you do feel confused, if you do feel uncertain, well, of course you do, because this is the latest version of this has just kind of burst on the scene. So the idea that within 12 months we all know what we're doing would be ludicrous. And as you'll see, if you read the report, people share your anxieties about all kind of aspects, for example, around the idea of verification, how reliable it is. So these are some of the big issues that people talked about: ethics. They're worried about the sort of closed nature of this. Who knows what the algorithms were? Who knows what the data was that these tools were based on? So people are very worried about, accountability and accuracy. People are also worried about people using this for bad use cases. And they're absolutely right to be, because people are. Right now, there are content farms knocking out really crappy journalism, or even misinformation, disinformation, because they do not care. They don't care if it's inaccurate or unreliable, because they are bad actors. So they're already at work. And obviously there's a threat there to trust in journalism. And generally the pace of this development of this technology is frighteningly fast. And we're all worried about, once again, having to depend on those big technological companies for the tools and platforms that we're doing our work on. And so, there's a real sense that this could be a big threat to us. But the great news was that newsrooms are learning ways to deal with it. They're pushing for greater transparency from the tech companies, but they're also thinking about how do they be more transparent themselves? How much do you tell people that you're using this tech, for example? A lot of newsrooms building ethical guidelines and thinking about using the tech to actually debias some of these tools. constantly keeping the human in the loop. It's a cliche, but it's absolutely important that there's always somebody when you adopt these technologies, when you use them, but also editing them, constantly reviewing them. And there are always going to be editorial tasks that are AI free. So, for example, I would perhaps suggest something like, if you're deciding what's the most important story on your website, well, that ultimately has got to be a human judgment. That's got to be according to your principles and your practice. The other way that people were dealing with this was collaboration. And collaboration, the colleagues on this call who have been part of our collab have enjoyed collaboration. But they didn't do it because it was kind of some kind of hippie, cuddly thing. You do it because it works. And it's not easy, actually. You have to reach out. You have to work with people you're not used to working with. But we can't do this on our own. Even if you're quite a big news company, you're going to need industry experts. You may want to work with, I don't know, universities, perhaps even come and work with us, but also working with other journalists and also internally making sure that you're working across the different departments in your news organizations, because this is a big, 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 big topic and we can't do it on our own. So just going to end now with some thoughts about how you approach this in a strategic way and some of the kind of big risks and opportunities around this. This is slightly repeating what I've said, but just to try and put it all in one place. If you are approaching AI, and you should be, there isn't an option, you have no choice, you've got to approach it in some way. First of all, get informed, just get that basic level of understanding for yourself as an individual journalist, perhaps, but also across your organization. And then try and broaden AI literacy. And obviously, this is what Corinne's doing with this work here at Wakely, trying to broaden AI literacy. AI literacy doesn't just mean knowing a bit about it. It means knowing what to do with it. What are the potential possibilities, and what are the, limits? What are the restrictions? What are the hazards of it? So that's really important. Then, make sure that somebody in your organization has responsibility, who makes sure they keep across all this, because it's changing every week. And it's their job to start the process structurally across the whole organization to make sure there's that conversation about it. And then start to use it small perhaps, but somebody will be using it. I promise you, somebody is using it in your news organization already. Somebody's playing with ChatGPT or they're playing with DALL-E. So you need to make sure that you're testing it, that you iterate it, you repeat it, and you review. You try and do it systemically. You try and do it in a thoughtful, considered way. And then I think it's really important to draw up guidelines. And this is partly to protect yourself. It's to reassure your staff that you're paying attention to it. It's also to reassure your audience, your users, that you're being thoughtful about this. And it's a really good process in itself, having that conversation. What are you worried about? What should we do? What are our principles? How can we avoid compromising our standards? So the guideline process, I think, is really helpful. And then, as I said, collaborating and networking as an individual person, but as a newsroom as well, generally, can save you so much time, because there are these big risks. There's the risks that apply to AI in any sector, whether it's health or retail or security or politics. We've got to be conscious that this powerful technology, but it has flaws. We're aware of that, its ability to discriminate, its ability to spread in disinformation, and then those big issues around copyright. Who owns the data that these models are trained on? Do you want to protect yourself from them using your data to train those models? And who has responsibility for anything that's created with these models? Basically, it's you. If you go and look at the terms and conditions of these tools, they basically, in all the small print, it says, guys, whatever you do with this it's your deal, it's your fault. And then there are these risks for the news media. When we think of us collectively, this problem of dependency. I mean, you remember Facebook with they changed their algorithm and suddenly everyone was left stranded. There's going to be a lot of competition because of this. Why would you bother clicking on a news website when you can just go to ChatGPT, ask them, or tools based on ChatGPT. So there's a huge business challenge there for journalism, a real threat to our business model, very much like the internet and social media was a threat, as well as a potential resource. And then there's those specific journalism risks for you as an individual journalist, the threat of inaccuracy if you misuse these tools, the threat to quality. But I think the biggest threat is the danger of being left behind. Because as I suggested earlier, the bad people, the naughty people, the commercial people, they are all using these tools right now. And if we don't get our act together as good journalists, if you like, then we're going to be left behind. And that's not a good thing. So there are the huge key opportunities for us. There are potential huge efficiency gains. I speak to journalists, individual journalists who are using this. I spoke to a guy in an international newsroom in London who does coding in the newsroom. And he said, yeah, I'm using chat. What was he using? He was using, ChatGPT to help him with his coding, even though his bosses had told him not to. And I said, okay, so is it useful? He said, yes, it makes me about 80% quicker, 80% more efficient. Now, I would say anything that makes you 80% more efficient is quite useful. We're all short of time, and we all need to know how we can be efficient too. And then there's some very simple, I think this is the big area in the next year. It's going to be tools that empower journalists. You're probably using them already, and you're not even thinking them as AI, but translation tools, transcription tools, and a big one, I think, reformatting. I've written a 1,000-word article, but I need a 100-word version for the newsletter. I've written a 1,000-word article, but I want an audio version. I want some suggestions for headlines. All these things that Gen AI can help you with. And some of them are going to be new products, like chatbots, like personalized newsletters, and so on. And it's going to help us to think of new ways to counter not just the so-called fake news, but also to understand bias. We've got a really interesting project at the moment. One of our teams looking at detecting bias using Gen AI. And ultimately, though, the hope, at least, is that if it can make you more efficient, then it will allow you as a human journalist to do the things that you do best, the things that AI is not so good at doing, things like investigations, things like having a specialism, expertise, things like having human interest, empathy, curiosity, creativity, and perhaps above all, real world reporting, going out there, going to council meetings, going into the street and talking to people, witnessing what is going on. AI cannot do any of those things. It has no judgment. It has no understanding of truth. It has certainly no understanding of emotions or values or morality or politics or ideology. So my hope is, at least, that this tech can free up time for you to do what you do best. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much. Thanks, Corinne.
Thanks, Charlie. That was fascinating. Wonderful overview. We do have a couple of questions in the chat, and this is a good moment as any, I think. I was chatting with some journalists at a news outlet this week about AI and knowledge sharing, and they said, well, really we should be sharing knowledge with each other, because a win for one is a win for everybody. If someone else does the learning for you, it means that everybody learns more quickly. And I think that's something that we've seen, with things like multimedia storytelling, for example. You'll see something that's published by somebody else and you think, actually, we could do that. So in the context of that, folks, we have 52 people in the chat, in the room. If you do want to and feel able to share the kind of tools that you're using, or any insights that you have that you feel others would benefit from, this would be a really nice moment to share that. Charlie, I just wanted to, there's a question here from, actually, I won't name names because people don't always like to be named in these sessions, but I will say we have a question about what people are using for scanning the websites and social media of particular organisations for key updates. We're experimenting with visual ping, but with limited success so far. Does anyone in the room have a a response to that. And Charlie, I know you mentioned earlier before we started the webinar that there isn't a one-size-fits-all tool, but would anyone like to respond to that question?
I mean, what I would say quickly is just just go on our website, for example. We've got a whole Airtable full of use cases, and we've also got a whole sort of social network on Slack as well, where people can do precisely this conversation, where you can go and ask people, because I think it is so specific. What works for somebody won't work for somebody else, and it's changing so quickly.
Okay, I think what we might do then is bring Gina and Saffron in, and I'll keep an eye on the chat and the questions there as we go. So, Gina, you've done one of the fellowships that Charlie mentioned. I was just wondering if you could tell us a bit about what that was like and how it's influenced your work at the ABC.
Yeah, so I'm Gina. I'm the editor at the Innovation Lab at ABC. So we work across all teams at the ABC, news content. We work with the product teams, AI and ML team. And last year, I'm a journalist and producer as well. So last year in the Innovation Lab at June 2022, myself and one of the data scientists in the AI and ML team took part in the JournalismAI Fellowship. And we partnered with a Spanish journalism startup called Neutral. And that prototype that we built was an internal fact-checking tool for journalists and editors. And so it looked at checking for potential false claims from politicians on Twitter, or X, as it's now called. And really that tool was about amplifying and the ability of journalists and things that they do every day, political journalists in particular. So really enhancing what they do. And it worked in a way that it was an internal tool. And so when a potential false claim came up, it would send an alert to a journalist or editor in Slack, and then it would present some supporting documentation and other fact checks. And an editor could potentially assign that to a journalist and say, this is something you need to look into. So it was really having that human checkpoint there as well. In terms of that prototype and what that project was for the ABC, it was really significant for the ABC. The AI and ML team at ABC have been working on AI and ML stuff for a while, but editorially, it was the first big project that the ABC had tackled, first editorial AI project that the ABC had tackled. So it raised lots of really interesting questions for us. It was about thinking about, what is this project in the early days? How does this, how can we assess this project through the lens of ABC values and approaching this while upholding our editorial policies, our legal obligations, all questions, privacy questions around using a third-party tool, how are we ensuring there's no bias in the labeling of the data sets that we were doing, all those kind of checkpoints. We were working with people from legal, editorial policies team, all across the ABC. And so it was really formative for us and led to us founding what you call an AI working group at the ABC. And so this is a few ABC representatives that meet regularly to discuss plans and thinking about an approach on AI at the ABC. And we share all the different projects that are going on. And I think that's a really important thing for a large organization with many, many different teams, to have that group of representatives come together and really think about an approach for a big public broadcaster. Yeah, so it was really, really formative for us.
Thank you. And Saffron, you're involved in something not dissimilar, a working group, but in a very different context to a multi-platform broadcaster at ACM. And some of the outlets that you're working with have very small numbers of staff. So how are you approaching the task of strategizing AI use?
Yeah, look, I think a lot of what Charlie said can be reflected in a lot of news organisations at the moment. And like the ABC, we've also got a working group, a cross-functional one at ACM, looking at, potential AI solutions, but also the risks associated with it, as much as we can tell what they are at this stage. So I think it's really important for those less resourced news organisations as well. Obviously, at regional publications, we're sort of stretched to the limit every day. So finding ways to make those mundane, repetitive tasks more efficient using generative AI, but also just automation. And I think it's one of the things that the sort of AI disruption journalists and editors the opportunity to ask questions and giving them some basic information about AI to sort of demystify it a bit, because as Charlie said, it's not just coming, it's here. So we're all going to have to grapple with this, and we're all kind of learning as we go.
Charlie, I've just been looking up the Journalism AI Academy to see if I can share a link in the chat. And I know that the APAC cohort has closed for this year. Are there plans to rerun that again in the future? Oh, you're on mute, my friend.
Not till, I think, possibly at the end of next year.
Okay, no worries.
But as I said, we're circling around. We're going to do a Spanish one, then an Arab one, and then I think we're doing an English one.
No problem. I've put the links to everything from JournalismAI Lab into the chat, so folks can sign up to newsletters and Slacks and so on, which hopefully will be helpful. And Saffron, you just recently went to the US on a scoping trip for ACM, and I'd love to hear a little bit about where you went and what you saw that stood out for you, that were learnings that you've brought back.
Yeah, it was fascinating. So I went on a study tour of Silicon Valley, so basically San Francisco, with the International News Media Association, joined by about 20 colleagues from around the world from different news organizations. And it was a very, very packed week in San Francisco, but fascinating. We met with people like Microsoft and Google and a bunch of startups working in the generative AI space with, whose models and platforms and tools have relevance to news. And it, prompted a lot of thoughts and discussion, obviously, for me. But I think some of the things I came away with is that generative AI, and I think, based on what Charlie said, it sort of seems logical once someone says it to you, but it's going to change our relationship with information. So how we actually interact with information, and it's going to become much more interactive rather than linear. And I guess for the news industry, we're used to we produce the information, you consume it. And generative AI is, we're now seeing this huge change. People want to have a conversation with information instead in that sort of chatbot space. So I think that's going to have huge implications for news. Probably other things that, we were talking a bit about in the sort of virtual green room before it, that that AI literacy is going to be really important for journalists and news organizations as well, and getting across that really fast. And that's going to mean, I work in the training space and upskilling people so that they've got enough knowledge to be able to use these tools and use them ethically and responsibly. Misinformation and disinformation is about to get worse. It's pretty bad already, but generative AI supercharges it. It enables much more convincing deep fakes, and it enables the production of misinformation to be much faster as well. And I think that's really important for us in the news industry too, because it's going to become even more valuable what we do, and building trust and rebuilding trust and retaining trust with audiences for news is going to be really important. So those were probably some of my big sort of takeaways. You know, we met like with about 22 businesses and news organizations and education providers and so forth. So that's condensing a very intense 7 days, if I can, into about a minute.
If because we do still have plenty of time in this webinar, so if I was to think about as a trainer, first of all, because you and I both come from a training background as well, is when you're thinking about approaching the learning that's involved in this, how do you approach that, particularly for perhaps smaller newsrooms? And Gina, you might like to speak to this as well, because you obviously have a lot of smaller bureaus across the country at the ABC, to try and make this less frightening or less concerning, speaking to that point that Charlie raised, and a little bit more, yep, we can do this. How do we approach the learning side of this?
Do you want me to go first?
I don't mind.
Oh, good. I've just been
Gina's
speaking.
nodding.
Gina or Charlie, do you want to jump in?
Oh, okay. I was nodding, saying you could go first, but that's fine. I'll jump in. I think, yeah, it's really, we're always thinking about the regional bureaus as well. Obviously, journalists work really hard on, deadlines, are covering a big area a lot of the time as well. So it's really, I think, in terms of what Innovation Lab does, we often talk to teams about, where are the pain points? How do you want to innovate? What are the things that, you're spending a lot of your time on? And, how potentially might we find something to solve that? Because I think I always like to approach it in terms of like looking at the use cases, like Charlie was talking about before, rather than sort of looking at all of the tools and then saying, how do we throw these at a problem? I think it's, you have to be across the tools and across everything that's going on, but really it's thinking about the journalism and where are those things where we could help journalists save time to get out into the field, because, for regional journos, it's a massive part of their job, but sometimes you're stuck doing news headlines or weather or whatever it is. And maybe thinking about, okay, how could we incorporate those tools? But I think it's really important to do that body of work around, and this sort of touches on the training, I guess, in a way, but, talking to them about AI, or talking to them about their jobs and seeing where, these tools could potentially fit in. Another part of what we're doing at the ABC is, of course, everybody's aware of ChatGPT. I'm sure that journalists, across Australia are all having a go at it and seeing how it worked. So for us, it was really about the risk as well, in thinking about making sure that our staff knew about the risks and really understood AI. So we've been carrying out what we're calling AI awareness training, I guess you'd call it. But really that's for staff to know, these are the legal risks, these are the editorial risks of using AI, and these are the opportunities. There's so much we could do here. And actually, this is how AI works. We had one of our data scientists present to them about AI, a real AI 101. So I think that really gets the cogs turning as well around them thinking about their jobs, and sort of creating that back and forth, a conversation with the teams, and then you can sort of marry up the jobs with the technologies that are out there.
Saffron?
Yeah, I mean, ACM's been on a very similar journey. I was furiously nodding when Gina was talking there. So we've been doing a lot of the same things, which is great. And I think that demystification is, probably that first step that, what Gina's called the awareness kind of training is just because AI is here and it is going to fundamentally change, our industry as well as the world. There's no point in sort of hiding from it. So letting everyone know what it is and how it works, I think, is really important. And I think, as someone with also having a media literacy background, I'm really enjoying the increased focus just in recent months on the need to build AI literacy generally in the general population, which I think is really important as well. And there's been some focus on that in Australia in recent weeks as well, about how important that is. Because, it has come with some fears around it, as anything that is unknown does. And beyond that, I think I would probably agree with Gina is that, I think one of the things we learned in our Polis JournalismAI Academy for Small Newsrooms is to not get taken up with the new shiny thing, but to look at where you have problems that need to be solved, and can Gen AI help you do that? Or is there just a simple automation solution here? Or have we just been going about this problem in the wrong way? And I really like the fact probably that Gen AI has prompted those conversations. And I think, beyond that, it will come down eventually to individual tools, but you got to make a pretty strong use case before you sort of get to that point.
Mm-hmm. I mean, with regard to media literacy, I suppose one of the things that interests me around the consumer side of the tools, is things like apps, being able to do different things in your phone, and coming from a mobile journalism background, that's something that I spent a lot of time training. What I noticed was that people were more comfortable approaching a sort of traditional television camera if they'd spent some time with a mobile app, because the app had been designed for a consumer market. And my sense is I'm also seeing that with AI, that people are having a go with some of the filters in TikTok and Instagram Reels, for example. And for me, of these tools so that people feel, yep, I can use this. My 12-year-old's using it. Where's a sort of point of an in for me that I can then expand that out into something that's more serious and is perhaps a more, bolts and bells and whistles tool that costs lots of money. So, Charlie, I mean, you've been delivering training in AI for years now. And I just wondered if there were thoughts that you have for those on the call, because I can see quite a lot of people on the call who are educated
True. It's much more intuitive. Journalism is a funny old thing, as you're probably aware, Corinne. It's a funny old process. It's very, it can be very fast. It can be very uneven and very provisional. So it's not like making ball bearings. It's not like making baked beans or whatever you have in Australia. But it's a very provisional process, which is very, very uneven. And the people working within it have learned to adapt to that. So one of the things I would say to people is, in a sense, do what you've done. I think Saffron and Gina are quite right, especially Saffron was talking about this is going to be hugely transformative. But the journalism, checking things, double sourcing things, working out what works for you rather than, oh, this is an amazing tool, we better use it, is still the priority. So in that sense, it's not so difficult. And I think if you think about how you, or certainly how it's a long time ago when I was in a newsroom, but when I learned, it was often by copying somebody. I was looking at the guy next door or the woman next door and say, oh, that's a really clever trick. That's a great way of writing a headline, or that's a great way of editing something. I'm going to copy that. And I'm really, pleased, especially with what Gina was saying about the way it's working at ABC, where you're trying to have a conversation about this. It's not a top-down thing. And I do see evidence of this. I see in big and small newsrooms, people having conversations. There's a huge commercial newsroom in London, I can't name them. They had an AI education day. Now, I've never seen an education day about anything in journalism before, but they realized that they had to have everyone as part of this conversation. Because there'll be somebody in the corner of your newsroom who's doing something clever or potentially something very risky. And you need to make sure that they can talk about it, that it's not going to be an easily rolled out program as yet, you know. So I'm quite encouraged. Obviously, I'm very encouraged by what Gina and Saffron have been saying about it.
I want to pick up a couple of points from the chat. I think what I'm hearing, I guess, from all three of you is that it's not always easy to think about a specific use case or a specific tool. But there's a question up here at the top around fact checking and verification. So if there are approaches and if there are tools that you've come across that you found useful, it would be great to hear about that. Please, thanks, Charlie.
Just because when we've got some, you know, when you come to the festival next week, because there are one or two people doing some great work on trying to use AI tools. But again, I think it's a really good example of where you mustn't expect a technological solution. Okay, there is not an AI tool that is going to spot all the fake news or eradicate all the. Do you know why? Because it's humans that create it. It's humans who decide to use these algorithms. It's politicians who decide to lie all the time, you know, and deliberately weaponize fake news. So in a way, I would say to journalists, you absolutely need to be able to use this thing to do fact checking, to do screening and so on, help you identify sources, you know, and we've got some, as I say, some lovely projects where people be talking about that. But in the end, it's going to be about your human judgment. And I think the big thing is, yes, look for tools that can help you with the fact checking and the fake news checking, but I would say concentrate on the good journalism creation. You know, concentrate on your own verification. Make sure that your sources are reliable. Make sure that the facts you've used are well sourced and you're not relying on social media, for example. So I think, you know, we should be paying much more attention to using these tools to support our work rather than hoping that somehow miraculously it's going to, you know, get rid of so-called fake news.
I mean, what I'm observing, I think, is that in terms of responses to bad faith actors, is that tools are being developed to respond to that. And that's, you know, it's always
about what your sources were. Well, I hope you will, because that will help build credibility and faith in those people in your journalism.
I wanted to ask all three of you, if you were having to be a consultant to a newsroom of any size, and perhaps think about the smaller newsrooms as well. I mean, even ACM, Saffron, you know, is a Eastern Seaboard organization, so it's not like it's just two editors and an advertising team in a tiny hyperlocal. But we are trying to support those kinds of outlets as well as the big ones with diversified staff. But if you were trying to think, okay, in order to not get left behind, which Charlie, you put in bright red letters in one of your slides as perhaps one of the bigger risks for 2024, what would be 3 action points from each of you if you were, you know, having that conversation over the back fence and saying, okay, well, here's the 3 things I think you should be thinking about between now and February so that you can go into 2024 with a reasonable chance of keeping up or catching up. Anyone would like to suggest some action points on that? I mean, mine is to spend a bit of time re-watching last year's Journalism AI Festival. I'll repost the link to that. I'll be sending out a reading list of reports and so on that I'll be wading through over the summer. to do a bit of catching up. So those would be two of my tips. I'll come up with a third one in a moment. Anyone?
Look, I don't know if I've got three right off the bat, but obviously, and I think we've said this in various ways in over the course of this hour, but you know, getting informed is the first one. Finding out, you know, and you know, Polis and Journalism AI have been doing exactly that, finding out what other newsrooms are doing, finding out what's out there, and having a better understanding of what AI is, and also not just within the context of news, but you know, within the context of the world. It's going to change a whole lot of aspects of our lives. So, and that always has some bearing on journalism and how we do things. I think probably within that point, I would say, would just reiterate that, and I said this to Charlie before we started this morning, is that I went into the Journalism AI Academy wanting to know about the tools. I was like, right, teach me all the tools I can use that are going to make my journalism better. And within a couple of sessions, I'd realized that the better approach is the strategic approach, where, and Gina mentioned this, you know, getting feedback from people. Where would it be useful for you to have a better solution to you spending a whole lot of time, you know, spending 20 minutes at the end of a day when you're trying to file your story and can't think of a SEO headline or whatever it is, you know, looking at it with a problem-solving approach rather than, you know, hey, can some tool magically do this job for me? You know, find out where you can sort of create efficiencies first, because and where your problems lie, where you are wasting time already, you know, and is AI a solution to that? So I think that would be my first tip as a kind of general approach. And I think one thing we haven't discussed a lot here, and I think it's been brought up in some of the chat comments and questions, but the putting guardrails around how you approach generative AI. So that's the very first thing we did when we set up our working group at ACM, is we developed the code of conduct for all staff. So knowing that this is a rapidly changing space, and where there are quite a lot of known risks, there are unknown risks as well. And we don't exactly know where it's taking us, and it's changing every day. So knowing, you know, being really clear what you are going to do, how you're going to test things and use them. And I would absolutely agree with Charlie. We've got to be transparent with our audiences, and that doesn't apply to just to individual organizations, because if one organization, especially in a tiny news market like Australia, isn't transparent with their audience about it, then that affects all of us and you know, the trust in journalism generally. So yeah, I think a collaborative approach to that would be great too.
Gina?
Yeah, I think picking up on what Saffron said, definitely at ABC, and I think for all organisations, it's important to think about, you know, what's the guidance around this, your editorial guidance. At ABC, it's particularly important. We have editorial guidance around AI, and we're looking at developing ABC AI principles that really anchor around, you know, all the decisions around AI are then made with this foundation of our values, trust, accountability, accessibility, and more. So that's really important. That's kind of the bedrock of going forward, I think, with AI. I think otherwise for most orgs, I would again think about the use case first, getting the hype from the usefulness, really talking to journalists and your teams about their day-to-day and helping them solve a problem. And how does that align then with your principles, guidance, etc. I think really test and learn quickly is the other thing. We do that at Innovation Lab and at the ABC a lot. So measuring the results, really reflecting on it rather than just using a tool and going, I don't know if that worked. Actually reflecting on why it didn't work. And I know that's hard sometimes on a daily, but you can still do that. And it's important to make the time around, you know, how did this tool actually help us? Did it help us, etc. And maybe look for something else if it doesn't. Test, learn, iterate. And really think about the editorial and legal aspects of the tools you're using, particularly third party. If you are looking at a third party tool, it's really important to look at the T's and C's, because there are serious copyright and defamation implications around certain tools. And so really get, you know, educate yourself and have a look at that. before you embark on using any of these things. And I think otherwise, just thinking about, mainly what are those tools that, really where the bias could be in these data sets potentially as well, like in the tools that you're using, what's the data that's been used to teach, I guess, the AI and train the AI tool. I think that's a really important one.
All of that assumes a lot of knowledge already. So for a small organization to start approaching something like what are the potential biases in this particular tool, you need to know what the tool is. And so to sort of step that back and think, if you were beginning your journey, and some outlets are, how do you jump into a fast moving river? And Gina, I'd love your thoughts on that. And Charlie, I'd love that from you as well, because you're dealing with organizations like that all the time coming through the AI Lab.
I think, like we're talking to teams, and I was this myself as a journalist starting out in AI probably mid last year. I think that you can use your journalistic skills to research. Like, you can look at this, you can follow key people on LinkedIn who I can, share. I think Felix Simon is someone who I follow on LinkedIn who's really great. All of the people from the Journalism AI Fellowship, the educators from that last year, keep up to date with what they're doing. They're analyzing these tools and they're talking about them. And you can do those deep dives into, I know the legal stuff, that can be a bit scary, but there's lots and lots of articles and research going on about this. So you can use the skills you already have to get into it. That would, be a short tip from me, I guess. Charlie, I'm sure we'll have more.
No, I would just say, listen, this is a really fantastic example of how it works. I mean, I've just been listening to Gina and Saffron saying, gold dust stuff about how you should be approaching AI. So listening to other journalists, and this is what I do for a living. I'm so privileged that the Polis project, the Journalism AI project, is basically just this. It's listening to journalists talking about how they are exploring AI. So that's what you should be doing. And it's fantastic. When I was a journalist, we didn't collaborate on anything. I wouldn't even collaborate with somebody in my own newsroom. I wouldn't share contacts or anything, but we can now. And I think that's just the practical way to do it. It's to share experience within your newsroom. You can put in systems. I thought it was fantastic what Saffron was saying about you've got to plan for the serendipity almost. You've got to certainly put in place processes, and be overt about this and explicit about this. But you don't have to be dictatorial about it. You don't say, you've got to do this, you've got to use this. But making that conversation happen. Collaboration is not easy. Conversations are not always easy. There's always some people who are going to be left out. And my God, it'll be that person who's left out of the conversation is going to end up doing something really stupid or perhaps really brilliant, and you didn't know about it. So I think that kind of systemic thing, it sounds a bit fluffy, it sounds a bit management consultancy, but it's also just good journalism. I thought what Gina was saying about just apply your normal or your better journalism principles to the adoption of these technologies, and you'll be right. Do some research. Have a look at what other people are doing. Certainly don't hide away. And that's my one little grumpy thing I would say is that I'm a bit sad that some of the kind of journalism coverage of AI has been so extreme. It's been about kind of robots taking our jobs or robots taking over the world, that it's actually distracted us from the real problems. I think Gina was talking about that. The real problem, is it reliable? How reliable is it? What's the best way to use it? These are much more important questions for us as journalists who have no time and, no resources. So, I hope we apply those principles. But I'm so enthused by just literally covering this workshop. It shows it can work.
On that, I might just take a moment, if I may, to quickly share my screen with some just upcoming things that we're doing next year. So just give me a moment. Is that one? Can you all see that?
Yep.
Great. So the Walkley Public Fund has provided some funding for some training in 2024. And that will consist, hang on, I'll just go back to here, of 7 sessions between February and June next year, where we want to really dig into job-specific applications of AI. The feedback I'm getting is that, people who are doing photography or video don't need the same, they don't need to spend as much time or the same, I suppose, the same sort of specific requirements as someone who's working in an investigative role or a data role or an advertising role even. And so we wanted to dig into that. And in terms of sharing knowledge, I know that there are more and more forums coming up. The JournalismAI Lab I have mentioned does have a great Slack group. So some of the questions you guys have put into the chat about which tools should I use, or what about ethics, or so on, that's actually a really good place to ask those kinds of questions. But we will also have a closed forum for people to have a crack at something and then share it and say, this is what I learned from that. I will repost the link and I'll put it in our Medium link. I would love your thoughts on what you need that training to cover, so that it is learner-centered, so that you help drive it. So there'll be a link to a survey. You're also obviously welcome to get in touch with me anytime. And if you want to keep across when things are coming up, there'll be a link to subscribe to our newsletter. And of course, this week, actually, it's the 5th and 6th. It's here already, Charlie. So the Journalism AI Festival is upon us, and I'll pop a link to that in the chat as well. I think that's pretty much it. I have been trying for most of this year to keep across what's out there in the world. So my best effort at a curated reading list will go out to folks who've registered. And in particular, what I've been trying to look for is newsroom policies, where those are going into the public domain. So Gina, the sorts of things that you're doing at the ABC, for example, where newsrooms are saying, this is the way that we're approaching this. Quite often it's on things like Neiman Lab and so on, which is a really useful resource. I'll capture that and pop it in a reading list. There isn't always as much time as I would like for reading, but at least I know where it all is. So, and again, putting that out into the Australian journalism community hopefully will mean that more brains are applied to this challenge and problem. I wanted to just one last question, which is, it's sort of perhaps not an end of conversation question, but I think it's something perhaps that we've touched on a little bit. And that is this question of third-party platforms. So I think as an industry, we've all experienced what happens when you put a lot of faith into third-party platforms like Facebook or Twitter or whatever, and then what the costs are if things change on that. What are perhaps some of the mitigation strategies when we're thinking about our to-do list for 2024 to prepare for a situation where perhaps OpenAI might not be so open, for example, or that some of these tools might not be so easily available? Does anyone want to speak to that?
Oh, look, I just echo what Charlie said, is that there are, at its core, journalism draws on a whole lot of things that artificial intelligence is never going to have. And it's the critical thinking, and it's the emotion, and it's the morals, and it's the values, it's the balance. And those are the things that are important to journalism, that have to remain no matter what the technical environment is that we're working in. So I think everyone acknowledges that we don't know exactly where AI is going to take us. So keep being great at really good journalism is my advice, because that's what makes journalism worthwhile to society and democracy. Yes, we absolutely have to know about the tech, and we journalism was notoriously slow to adjust to the internet world and to make that digital transition, and it did it too late. We absolutely have to get on board with AI, but we've got to keep doing great journalism, and I think that's what's going to see us through.
Yeah, Gina, any thoughts from you on this?
Yeah, I think it's just thinking about those risk mitigation measures, and it's a very dull answer, but I think it's just really being across, again, the terms and conditions, using your journalism skills to have a look at that. You know, and this is speaking not from the ABC's perspective, but I think for all organisations, it's treating third-party tools, depending on what they are, as a public platform. Whatever information that you're putting in there, you should treat it as potentially public, because it is going in there to feed you know, the system and help to train the AI. So if you don't put in private information, you don't put in any kind of sensitive or confidential information into there, because I think one of the data scientists at ABC has this saying, if you're not buying the product, you are the product. So particularly if it's free, then really consider what sort of information you're putting in there and whether you'd want that to be made public. So no pre-pub content. I think as well, making sure you keep the human in the loop with third party. If you are using third party at your organization, use the same editorial rigor around those results, like Charlie was talking about, with any results you get from an AI tool. You know, it's really about making sure that you, almost as if like if an interviewee, if an AI is giving you a result, you wouldn't just put an interview straight to air without checking it. You would check what that is. You wouldn't publish that straight away. You check that all the facts in that. So it's keeping the human in the loop. So I think just really thinking about that you are essentially accountable if you are using these tools. So really making sure you use your editorial judgment and sort of the things that we're thinking about.
Thank you so much. And I guess one tip from me is this. I mean, I feel like at the moment, a lot of people are sitting at base camp of AI, looking at the glittering Everest, which seems to get taller every day, you know. And so we are in an industry which has a lot of people who are very stressed and burned out, and we need to also look after our mental health. And so one of the things that I would really encourage is to identify as many group forums as you possibly can, so that you're not trying to just be an island trying to keep across a huge field, a huge and evolving field. It can't be done by one person. And also just to take a bit of time, 10 minutes, it's like Pilates, right? 10 minutes a day of having a look is better than trying to save it all up for a period of time. And I've set a Google News alert for myself for, OpenAI ethics, a few sort of search terms that might want to come up, so that things are landing in my inbox, that I might not otherwise see. I also just wanted to touch back. Somebody mentioned earlier, and I don't think it's in my reading list, so I will recommend that folks, that you follow a chap called Sam Gregory on Twitter, if you're using X these days. So Sam is perhaps, Charlie, I guess to me, he's really one of the people who are keeping a huge eye on verification, deep fakes, hoaxes, etc. And there's not a day goes by that I don't go onto Sam's Twitter feed and go, that was extremely useful. So that's, I guess, a tip from me. I think we're out of questions, so perhaps we might wrap there if everyone's happy with that. Does anyone have anything that they wanted to add at the end?
I just wanted to add something on the overwhelm. I think it is even overwhelming sometimes when you are working with AI. And I know that it seems like a really big thing, but I think really ultimately it will be there in the newsroom, in the job that you're doing. So really it's about thinking about the tasks in your job, and then you can kind of pursue it and explore it from that angle. Like Charlie was saying before, if you really want to, you've got a text article and you want to turn it into an audio thing, you can just Google AI tool that turns, what is the task, and sort of approach it that way rather than sort of the enormous mountain you're describing, Corinne. I think that's because it is hugely overwhelming. There's so much happening and changing every single day. So I think kind of approaching it from the use case and, thinking about your own jobs or your own newsrooms is a good way to start, and just getting on YouTube and looking at, there's heaps of videos out there doing 101 explainers, and you can find anything on there. So I think approaching it that way, small scale at first, is a good way to approach it.
I guess, my final tip would probably be for some of the people working in those small newsrooms with, very few resources, independently owned, out in regional Australia and that kind of thing, which is, and I think there've been a few comments and questions on the chat you know, have a play around, but we're really conscious of the things like Gina has said, where that's also the, if you're not being charged for the product, then you are the product, is also a little bit of a saying of ours in our AI working group. So being really careful with that. But definitely joining all those chats and groups as well. If anyone has any questions after this, you know, reach out to me on LinkedIn or wherever. Really happy to have a chat. I'd really like collaborating on this kind of stuff, and happy to share my knowledge. So yeah, I think opening up the conversation, and this was a great way to do it. So thanks to Corinne and the Walkley Foundation. And Charlie.
Thank you. Any closing thoughts, Charlie? Apart from it's Sunday night, thank you so much for staying up so late.
Sunday night, my goodness. No, I would just say, do whatever Gina and Saffron have said, because I think it's just brilliant. And the wonderful privilege of my work is that I get all this feedback from people around the world, and there is a sense that we can do this. You know, and one of the surprising things actually has been small newsrooms. You don't have to be a huge newsroom like, well, ABC is a relatively huge newsroom. You know, you don't have to be a huge newsroom to do this. It's about us as individuals. I do not know how this is going to play out. Okay, I don't. I can see all sorts of wonderful benefits, but I can also see lots of risks. And I know that this isn't going to solve journalism, but you are all working too hard. You're all being paid too badly, and everyone is horrible to you on social media. AI is not going to get rid of those problems for you as a journalist, but I think it can empower you. You know, I really do. I've seen that in my own career. I've seen all the people we work with, and that is my biggest hope. And it's so wonderful to, you know, talk to Gina Saffron, because I think they can tell you that works.
Thanks so much. Well, friends, we'll wrap it up there. So we've been joined by Professor Charlie Beckett, Director of the JournalismAI Lab at Polis LSE in the UK, Gina McKeon, the ABC's Innovation Editor, and Saffron Howden, National Editorial Training Manager at ACM. Thank you so much, and we will send you a recording and be in touch. All the very best.